सर्वेभ्यो नमो नमः। नन्दामि यत् अत्र मिलित्वा वयमेतस्मिन् विषये चर्चां करिष्यामः। Let me begin by thanking the foundation and Dr. Anirban Ganguly and Amit Malviya in particular for having invited me to speak at this National Writers' Meet on a subject that's close to everyone's heart. The brief that's been given to me is to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you may have, provided I know the answers. And I'll be happy to listen to your comments because the objective is not so much a question and answer session, but an interactive session. The Modi government. This is a government that was elected in May 2014. Where was this government elected? This government was elected in Delhi. It's an union government. The reason I'm flagging this point is because we have a constitution. Under the constitution, there are two other organs of state as well. There is parliament and there is the judiciary. Under the constitution, there is a 7th schedule which sets out very clearly what areas are under the purview of the union government, what areas are on the concurrent list, and what areas are the purview of state governments. It is important to remember this obvious point, which people often tend to forget. Because having propounded the proposition that the Prime Minister is a dictator, they tend to assume that he actually is a dictator and therefore can ignore the other organs of democracy and the Constitution. So quite often there is a criticism that why isn't this particular piece of legislation being changed overnight? Why isn't that particular piece of legislation being changed overnight? As everyone present here knows, changing legislation is a time-consuming process. Particularly in a situation where Parliament does everything else except its core business, which is one of legislation. So you cannot expect changes in legislation overnight. You cannot expect the judiciary to be ignored. You cannot expect democracy to be ignored. This is a union government, as I said. And depending on the year, between 90 to 95% of India's national income originates in states. Many of the things that we would like to be changed are under the purview of state governments. A lot of debate goes on around the land legislation of 2013. I'm constantly surprised when I ask people in the 7th schedule, where is land? And people tend to say it's on the concurrent list. Land is not on the concurrent list. Land is squarely on the state list. It's a different matter that the UPA government justified the 2013 legislation on the basis of a completely different entry, which was about acquisition of property. What we should have asked then is, how on earth is Parliament, how on earth is a government pushing through legislation on an area that is entirely in the state list, which is nothing else, is contrary to the philosophy of the 7th schedule and of the Constitution. To the best of my knowledge, this government never said, the Prime Minister never said, we will accomplish everything that we want to accomplish in 2 years. We will accomplish everything that we want to accomplish in 100 days. These are suggestions that are imposed by others. To the best of my understanding, the changes that are sought to be brought about are changes that undermine several things that we have been familiar with since independence in 1947 and since the Constitution came into being in 1950. So therefore, these fundamental institutional changes require time. They are not even a 5-year agenda. They are a 10-year agenda and even more than that. So the time frame is a long time frame. Government. Why do we elect a government? We elect a government because we expect that government to deliver public goods and services. That's the reason people throughout the world elect governments. Governments are there to deliver public goods and services. But there are 2 points you must remember in this connection. The first point is, India's per capita income today is $1,600 US. The richest country in the world has a per capita income that is around $75,000 US. So to visit North America or to visit Western Europe and to expect that the delivery of public goods and services in India will be the same as the delivery of public goods and services in North America or Western Europe today is a completely unrealistic assumption. It's an apples versus oranges comparison. So the first point to note is a government will always have limited fiscal resources. In a relatively poor country like India, there will always be limited fiscal resources. In a relatively poor country like India, there will always be limitations in terms of administrative capacity of government. So therefore, because of fiscal constraints, because of administrative constraints, there must be a prioritization of those public goods and services. As citizens, we expect the government to do too many different things. If we expect the government to do 50 different things, it will do all 50 of those different things inefficiently. Therefore, we need to prioritize. If we take a vote around this room, everyone here will have his or her own priority about what these public goods and services are. But the moment you mention prioritization, somewhere down the line, I think all of us will agree that the most important public goods and services that we expect a government to deliver are: 1, law and order and security; 2, certain elements of physical infrastructure like roads, water and electricity; and certain elements of social infrastructure like education, skills, primary health. And if as a government we can ensure that these are delivered, then many of the other things will follow. How many villages does India have? Today, India has around 600,000 villages. In around 100,000 of these villages, these public goods and services that I just mentioned are still missing. They are not available. It is a crying shame that after more than 6 decades of independence, these 100,000 villages still lack law and order, security, access to the judicial system, roads, water, electricity, primary health, access to schools. So the priority for any government must be to ensure that these are delivered. Why is this important? This is important because, in my view, no able-bodied person in the working age groups is ever voluntarily poor. No able-bodied person in the working age groups is ever voluntarily poor. If a person is poor, if a person is unable to improve his or her life, that is because that individual or that household lacks access to these public goods and services that I just mentioned. So the true definition of inclusion, the true definition of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas is that the government must ensure that these public goods and services are delivered. This is the message of empowerment as opposed to the message of entitlement. If we can ensure that these public goods and services are delivered, then people do not need doles. No one willingly wants doles. I mentioned these public goods and services. Who delivers these public goods and services? If you go back to the 7th schedule, you will find that most of these public goods and services that I mentioned, with the exception of law and order and security, are not delivered by the union government. They are delivered by state governments. They are delivered by local bodies. The urban local bodies, the municipalities, and the panchayats. There is any amount of research which shows that India, in terms of governance, is excessively centralized. It was centralized under the British. It became even more centralized post-1947 because of the planning process. So one of the most important things that needs to be done is the decentralization and the fiscal devolution. One of the most important changes that this government has brought about, to my mind, it is the most important change that this government has brought about, is to ensure the beginnings of this decentralization. One part of that is in the Finance Commission. If you read the Constitution, but before the Constitution, traditionally there were two channels of fund flows to state governments. The first one was the Finance Commission. And the second one, historically, was the Planning Commission. If you read the Constitution, you will find that the only legitimate constitutional organ for devolution of funds to state governments is the Finance Commission. But the Finance Commission's mandate, the Finance Commission's constitutional mandate, was diluted consciously in the beginning of the 1970s. And consequently, the artificial plan versus non-plan distinction was created. And increasingly, a large amount of formula-driven as well as discretion-driven fund transfers to states used to happen through the organization that preceded Niti Aayog, the Planning Commission. The 14th Finance Commission made some recommendations. As a result of the recommendations of the 14th Finance Commission, the share of the divisible pool that was going to go to states increased sharply from 32% to 42%. Quite often you will hear states complaining. I will come back to that later. So the share of the states in the divisible pool of resources was increased from 32% to 42%. An unprecedented increase in untied funds. Do you think it was very easy for the union government to agree to this recommendation? There was OROP, there was the Pay Commission, there was the Fiscal Deficit Reduction Commitment, there was the requirement to build railways and airports in parts of the country that had historically been neglected, like the Northeast. There was a compulsion to build national highways. Given all of those, it would have been very, very tempting for the union government to say that we cannot increase it from 32% to 42% at one go. We will increase it from 32% to 37%, and the remaining 5% will be increased later. That wasn't done. So a sharp increase from 32% to 42%. But over and above this, there used to be what are called central sector and centrally sponsored schemes. Who decided on these central sector and centrally sponsored key schemes? The predecessor organization, the Planning Commission, did. Sitting there in Yojana Bhavan, they determined the template of these centrally sponsored schemes. So you had something like the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, which is a scheme for building rural roads. under the template of the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, you could use that money to build roads. But a road sometimes requires a bridge. And the template of the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana did not allow you to build a bridge. So if you are a relatively cash-rich state like Gujarat, you added your own state-level scheme to build the roads. And if you are a relatively cash-starved state like Jharkhand, you had roads without any bridges. So these central sector and centrally sponsored schemes remained over and above the 42% that I have mentioned. Who would decide on the new schemes? It would have been very tempting for Niti Aayog to decide on these schemes, the new schemes and the new templates. It would have been very tempting for North Block to decide on those schemes. It would have been very tempting, perhaps even for PMO to decide on those schemes. Instead, what was done? Instead, 3 subgroups of chief ministers were set up. One of these subgroups was headed by the chief minister of Madhya Pradesh. Another subgroup, the one headed by the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, was on the centrally sponsored schemes. Another subgroup on skill development was headed by the Chief Minister of Punjab. And the third one on the on the Swachh Bharat mission was headed by the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. And every Chief Minister was a member of one or the other of these subgroups. It is a different matter that a chief minister who has not attended governing council meetings shoots her mouth off and said it was an arbitrary decision on the part of the prime minister to set up these subgroups. The fact of the matter is, the setting up of these subgroups was determined at a governing council that all the chief ministers attended, except that she did not attend it. So obviously she does not know that the entire assembly of chief ministers decided on these subgroups. These subgroups submitted their reports in October 2015. As a result of these subgroup recommendations, which were submitted in October 2015, there is no discretion anymore. There is no discretion on the 14 Finance Commission recommendations. There is no discretion on the centrally sponsored schemes. The October 2015 reports of these 3 subgroups are up there on our website in public domain. So there are chief ministers, whom I shall not name, who complain. Earlier we used to have these discussions with the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission would give us money. Now no one gives us money. Well, no one gives you discretionary money anymore. There is no scope for discretion. Everything is transparent. The annual ritual of going to the Planning Commission and haggling over money is over and done with. The money you are going to get is cast in stone. What is Niti Aayog going to do? Niti Aayog's job, amongst various other things, is to monitor the implementation of these public expenditure schemes and to take you to task if a state government fails to, let us say, reduce the infant mortality rate. I'm suggesting the infant mortality rate as one example. So we have a whole set of indicators straddling primarily physical and social infrastructure, where we will monitor whether the state governments are able to successfully improve those indicators. We will benchmark them. One of the differences between the Planning Commission and Niti Aayog is, and it is more than symbolic, is the chief ministers used to come to the Planning Commission. They don't come to the Planning Commission. We go to the states. That is what transparency is all about. Sometimes I've heard people complain, the Prime Minister doesn't meet us. Why should the Prime Minister meet you? If there are no problems, there is no particular reason for you to meet the Prime Minister. So it's extremely desirable that the frequency with which you meet the Prime Minister or the Commerce Minister or the Finance Minister comes down. Because that means things are becoming more and more transparent. I said states complain. You must understand that there are two reasons why states complain. One is genuine and the other one is not that genuine. The not that genuine one is every finance commission or every transparent process has a certain formula. You have had your chance to present your case before the finance commission or before the subgroups of chief ministers. At the end of it all, some states gain a little bit and some states lose a little bit. That's part of life. You've had your opportunity to make your case. Despite that, the case has not been made entirely to your satisfaction. It happens all the time. The second reason why they have a genuine reason to complain is, notice the month I mentioned. The subgroups of chief ministers submitted their reports in October 2015, which means that until those reports were available, fund flows to states was bound to get disrupted. And it is indeed the case that in the financial year, in the fiscal year 15-16, fund flows to states were disrupted. But now that the reports are available, now that the recommendations have been accepted, from 16-17, there should no longer be any disruption in fund flows to states. I should quickly mention that there are three other important changes that are going to happen or are likely to happen in the budgetary process. I'm not saying they will happen from April 2017. These are complicated issues, so they may happen from April 2018, but there are three changes that are important and significant. The first one is an abolition of the planned versus non-planned distinction. This is likely to happen from April 2017. The second one, I'm not very sure it will happen from April 2017, but will happen at some point in time, not very far away, is an end to the railway budget. The reason I'm not sure how long it will take is I describe it as a divorce after being married for several years. Then there are complicated issues that have to be settled, division of property, even alimony. So these things take a little bit of time. So I'm not very certain it's going to happen from April 2017. It may drag on till April 2018. The third major change that is going to happen, or may happen, I'm underlining the use of the word may, is a change in the fiscal year. There have been arguments since actually 1867 that this fiscal year is not the right fiscal year to use. There is a committee that has been set up under the chairmanship of the former Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Shankaracharya. This committee is examining this issue and will submit a report by December of 2016. That's why I said this is a change that may happen, it won't necessarily happen. After all of this, there will be people in the country who are poor. And people in the country who are poor must be subsidized. Except that we must unambiguously be able to identify the people who are poor and are therefore the beneficiaries of subsidies. In the President's address to Parliament, the President said that the only way to identify the poor is through decentralized identification. You're looking puzzled because you don't know which president. This is the President's address to Parliament in 2004. A President's address to Parliament is invariably drafted by the incumbent government. And I forget whether, do you remember whether it was May or June? Whichever month it was. In May or June 2004, the then President made an address to Parliament and said, we will do decentralized identification of the poor. You will find it in paragraph 38 of that speech. Paragraph 38 of that speech was about what UPA 1 promised to deliver in the first 100 days. Was a single one of those promises ever implemented, including this one? The answer is no. Now, finally, we have a database which the UPA government had started but never began to use, which is known as the SECC database. The SECC database is a census, it is not a survey. Why is it important? It is important because it is my belief that poverty is an individual household characteristic. If we equate poverty with collective characteristics like ethnicity, caste, religion, and gender, we will make a double mistake. We will include people who should not be included simply because they happen to belong to that collective category, and we will exclude people who should be included simply because they do not belong to that collective category. Poverty should be on the basis of individual household identification. The SECC rural is already ready. The SECC urban needed to be refined a little bit. The SECC urban is also now ready. The SECC databases, by the way, are a little bit old. They are for 2011-12. So as a government, we need to figure out how those can be updated swiftly. The SECC databases are increasingly going to be identified. They've already begun to be identified for several government programs that involve subsidies. Be they at the union government level, be they at the state government level. You will also have read about the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana accounts. It is true that no one is quite certain whether all the Jan Dhan accounts that have been created are truly new or not. Because they've been primarily created by the BCs working on behalf of the public sector banks. RBI and DEA are examining this and are trying to clean up those accounts to check whether they are really new accounts. That cleaning up process suggests that at least 50%, I did not say 50%, at least 50% of these accounts are clean or new accounts. So if this kind of number is correct, for a very, very long time in India, we debated the issue of financial inclusion. If this kind of number is correct, then the debate of financial inclusion interpreted as opening bank accounts for the unbanked population is now a historical debate. The debate really shifts to having financial products to persuade people to use those bank accounts. I'm not negating the importance of that debate, but that's where the debate shifts. So increasingly what is happening is you have a SECC database, you have the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana database. Both of these are being seeded with Aadhaar cards, and there will be direct benefit transfers into these accounts. We have just seen the beginnings of this process. So whatever studies you see are sort of limited studies. You will find studies which say that in Chandigarh, instead of buying gas, when the equivalent amount was transferred into the accounts, poor people topped up their mobiles. I see nothing wrong with that. It is their money, let them decide what they should do. Because one of the important changes again with this government is the acknowledgement that as a government I do not know the answer to everything. Why should I know the answer to everything? People are not stupid. Provided I empower them, provided I have the regulation in place, let people have the right to choose. Which reminds me of something that I have not mentioned yet, so let me mention it quickly in passing. Something like health. There is constant criticism. The union government has slashed its expenditure on health. If you go by the 7th schedule again, with the exception of the medical council, health is not even on the concurrent list. It's completely on the state list. So if state governments have been given that 42%, what do you expect them to spend it on? You expect them to spend it on the social sectors and the physical infrastructure. On health, it is Niti Ayog's view, not a final view because we are still debating it. So I should say it's my personal view that in health also people should be given the choice. Kerala does one particular thing in health. Gujarat does a completely different thing in health. Tamil Nadu does a completely different thing in health. So even if the objective is to reduce the infant mortality rate, let us recognize that the tools used to reduce the infant mortality rate will vary between Bihar and Kerala. Indeed, it will vary between different districts of Bihar. So while it is important to provide insurance to people, and I have not had the time to mention this, but several of the government initiatives are designed to deliver a social security infrastructure for people. So once I have provided the insurance, why should I insist that that insurance will only be tenable at a government hospital? If the person so wishes, let him or her go to a list, go to anyone from a list of recognized and empaneled private doctors and hospitals. But I've digressed. Notice that word governance. What does the word governance mean? And how is it different from the word government? There must be a difference between the word government and the word governance. Otherwise, why have we coined a new expression called governance? Delivery of public goods and services is the role of governments, union, state, local bodies. What is governance? There are several definitions of governance that float around. UN, OECD, World Bank. Across all of these definitions of governance, you will find a common theme. And that common theme is governance is about the decision-making process also. Governance is also about the participation of people. And let me mention the Smart City mission now. I meet people and they say, what is Niti Ayog's idea about what a smart city should look like? And I say, why should Niti Ayog have any view about what a smart city should look like? There is a template, and under the template, it is up to the citizens, working with the municipal bodies, working with the state governments, to decide under that template what part of smartness they want to impart to their city. The two top cities in that initial list of 20 cities under the Smart Cities mission are Bhubaneswar and Pune. And if you look at the visions that Bhubaneswar and Pune have planned, they're completely different. Because the citizens of Bhubaneswar interpreted smartness in one way, and the citizens of Pune interpreted smartness in a completely different way. And that indeed is the way it should be. Because if this country is to change, and I believe this country is on the cusp of a change, if this country is going to change, that change cannot be done only by government. That change has to be brought about by citizens. Unless citizens participate, unless citizens become less cynical, unless citizens begin to change the system, this country is not going to change. Let me relate a brief anecdote. Because of the work with the railways, I used to travel a lot on trains. Not always the Rajdhani and Shatabdi, but smaller trains, which stopped often at relatively nondescript stations. On one of these occasions, we stopped at a station in UP, and it was 1 a.m. in the night. We got down from the train, and there was a vendor selling food items. My wife was also with me, and we got down. Along comes a person, hefty, buys something from there, and throws it on the platform, the wrapper on the platform. Before I could stop her, my wife on this deserted platform goes and catches hold of him, and says, please pick up that wrapper, there's a waste paper bin there, please go dump it in that garbage. I thought, oh my God, middle of the night, trouble. He picks it up, deposits it on the garbage bin. So I asked the vendor. Vendor says, ये स्वच्छ भारत मिशन का असर है. And the Swachh Bharat mission, no matter how cynical we are about the Swachh Bharat mission sitting here in Delhi, traveling throughout India, I'm not saying everywhere in India, but in many parts of India, the Swachh Bharat mission has led to a change. That's the reason I mentioned this as an anecdote. 2 or 3 other points and then I will stop. The government needs to generate resources for the things it needs to do. This government has been criticized for not divesting or doing anything about the public sector enterprises. That task has been entrusted to Niti Aayog, and you will find some action there pretty soon. There is revenue that can come through taxes, but for revenue to come through taxes, you need to eliminate tax exemptions. The agenda for removing tax exemptions is already there. And if you see a lot of negativity, particularly in the real estate sector and to a lesser extent in capital markets, some part of that negativity is because of the clamping down on cash transactions, which I think is a very, very desirable objective. 2 last points. Land I already mentioned is on the concurrent list. The initial changes did not work out because some state chief ministers who had promised support backed out. So the land changes are being done at the level of the state governments. On labor laws, which is on the concurrent list, the eventual goal is the complete unification of the 50-odd union government laws under 4 heads. 1, wage-related, 2nd, social security-related, 3rd, safety-related, and the 4th, industrial relations-related. So I hope I have broadly described the agenda. It is not an agenda that is anywhere near completion. It's an agenda which is a journey. In the process, something quickly I shall mention because Amit specifically asked me to mention this. Government is also about laws. Laws do not mean only laws at the union government level, laws also at the state government level. At the union government level, I do not know how many people are aware that under 4 acts, around 1,200 old laws have already been repealed. So the number of union government laws that now remain has come down from around 2,500 to 500 at the union government level, and there are another 250 that the state governments have to repeal. Finally, on state government laws, I did not mention states at all. In Rajasthan, the number of laws has already been reduced, not just old laws, from 900 to 250. And we are working with other states, Jammu and Kashmir and Maharashtra to start with, to help them reduce the number of laws there also, because that is also part of the minimum government, maximum governance agenda. Thank you very much.